right, let us answer some questions from our Patreons. Remember, if you want to ask your questions first, support us on Patreon. Support us on Patreon allows you ad-free stuff, it allows you questions like this, gives you access to our Discord server, all that sort of stuff. It's great. You should definitely do it. James says, how good is Robata as a T20 bowler? I mean, there's obviously no problem with talent. I think that he hasn't quite worked out what his best. He hasn't really worked out a line or a length or slow balls or what he needs to be consistently successful in T20 bowling. And at the death, he's just, he probably has worked it out. It's really that rest of that part of the game. Where does he fit in? Should he bowl more in the middle? How does he use the new ball better? And he's not the only one. I think we had a question like this similar recently, James, about Pat Cummins. In fact, it might have been about both of them. They just haven't worked it out, and it's not an easy thing. I mean, Peter Siddle is one of the players that I look at where you look at the early part of his career and he just didn't really know where to bowl in T20 cricket. And other people work it out almost instantly, right? And so there is a huge difference between those sorts of players. The problem with someone like Robata or Cummins is how much time, do they want to spend thinking about that and experimenting with it, right? They're basically only playing top level T20 cricket, either internationals for their country or IPL. So either the money's on the line or the national badge is on the line. If that's the case, it's a bit awkward to suddenly start experimenting with things and trying different things. And I think Peter Siddle, I'm trying to remember if he did it with the Strikers and maybe Essex or something like that. It's easier to experiment in those kinds of areas, find what is best for you. So I'll never pretend that Rabada's not going to be a good T20 bowler, but he's not as effective as he should be as a bowler of his obvious talent. Will says, does this winter give us reason to think better of Justin Langer as a T20I coach? Well, for those who don't know, he wasn't really in charge of the last World Cup when they won. It's funny looking back on it. He kind of pushed the reins across to Andrew McDonald at that point. I think I don't think anyone thought he was bad. In fact, I've always thought that Langer's best skill was probably in the T20 realm. If you go back to Western Australia, they're pretty ordinary in everything except for T20 cricket. And I think Langer did some interesting things. I do think he was a bit old-fashioned in the way that he thought about T20 cricket compared to someone probably like Andrew McDonald. So there is that. But yeah, no, I don't. No, I don't think so. I thought he was the wrong hire at the time. They're a very successful team. You have that many good bowlers in your side, and peak Steve Smith. You're going to have some success in red ball cricket. I think ultimately the players had moved on beyond him. They were all working for coaches who were seen as more intelligent, who were better to deal with, who were maybe more modern in the way they were thinking. I don't think that was particularly Justin Langer at that point. So I could certainly see why they decided to move on. And I think Cricket Australia moved on for different reasons, and the players for many different reasons. I was never a big fan of Justin Langer as a coach before or after getting the Australian job. Nothing much has changed, in my opinion. Will says, would it be better to have ODI power plays at the end of the innings, 10 overs that begin and in the 40th over when the sixth batter comes in, so that the rhythm is different to T20 and there's more place for traditional test openers? Well, I mean, the power play exists where it does well so that we have excitement at the start. So there is something there. I have said in T20 cricket, and you can make a similar argument for one-day cricket if you wanted to. I actually think the best way to do it is kind of to have, 2 players out in the first phase, 3 players out in the second phase, 4 players, et cetera, till you get to the full players out at the end when the players are going to attack anyway. Because that then should allow for exciting cricket all the way through. And, let's say you're consolidating and, I don't know, you've lost 4 wickets and you're in the 20th over or the, 7th over, whatever it may be. And you're consolidating, but you've still got only 3 players out. Thinking to yourself, there's a bit of risk and reward here. And it could end up that what we what might happen, which is similar to what happened when we changed the one-day rules, playing conditions slightly, which was you got a lot of higher scores and a lot of lower score games. Um, and I'm not sure that that is, the weird thing is those sort of weird middling games maybe are slightly, it means that the teams are slightly closer to each other and there's less extreme scoring in either direction. But yeah, I mean, there are a million things you could do to change one day cricket to make it less like T20 cricket. I just don't think that's how they're thinking about those sorts of things anymore. Um, but yeah, there's absolutely tons. I mean, the bowling restrictions is the most obvious one. If you change your bowling restrictions so no one bowls more than 12 or 13, or it would be 13 overs, wouldn't it? Which I think they did in domestic Australian cricket, late 90s, early 2000s. Can't remember when it was. That would make it very different than T20 cricket. But I think T20 cricket will just continue to develop in a way separate to one day cricket anyway. Uh, like I think if we're ever gonna have a tournament which is played on a synthetic surface, T20 cricket will be the first one to get there, even if they start with hybrids and everything else. Where are we? James says, at what age do you think representative level of cricket starts to become useful in player development and talent ID? Based on my memory of playing junior cricket and watching groups of juniors coming through, I don't really see the point in state, county, province teams for kids younger than 12, 14. Cricket mad kids lose interest. Kids that dominate due to early physical development find their peers catch up, etc. Yeah, so it's a really interesting thing about junior cricket in general, which is most players are going to, unless you're a physical outlier in one end of the spectrum, either you're incredibly tall or incredibly strong or incredibly short or incredibly weak. Chances are you are in age group cricket going to be dominated by the faster players, the stronger players, the more mature players, physically development, even emotionally development players. So age group cricket to me is a really good system as long as you then have another system for players who develop between the age of 18 and 26, 27. There's something I was listening to on one of the basketball podcasts recently. They were talking about how European basketball, at 26, you could still become a professional. Whereas if you finish playing college basketball at 22 in America, or even high school basketball, and you don't get picked up by any colleges, and you continue to develop, but now maybe you're working in a factory or something else. You can't just join a club, right? And I do think in certain cricket environments, uh, without the stronger sort of club elements, you are missing out on those sort of late blooming players. And there's good things and there's bad things within that. But you know, to have a player who maybe at 20 was had a growth spurt and suddenly develops very quickly, if they're out of the system because at 16 they were bowling at 85 miles an hour and you wanted or 75 miles an hour and you want everyone to be bowling at 80 and 85 miles an hour, but at 22 if they're 6'8" and they're still bowling and they've just developed physically and they're now at 80 to 85 miles an hour, but they're 6'8", that might be something that you'd be worth looking at. And that's just a physical development that can happen later in some people. Um, People develop physically so much different. I think now looking back on like a lot of my early success in sport is because I was taller than everyone else. I had my growth spurt at 12, whereas, and most of my friends had their growth spurt 15, 16, 17, 18. And so for a long time, in all the sports that I played where, height was important, I dominated in all those sports. And then everyone caught up and went flying past me. And so I think, I would have, and I had friends who did the same thing, who ended up playing, representative sports, just because of, physical strength and everything else. So I do think from that perspective, it's a problem. But I don't think, uh, cricket mad kids are going to come and, if you're cricket mad, you're going to stay. It's those casual athletes that I think are harder to keep around. But I would say this, that I think those sorts of athletes will come and go anyway, right? What you really want is a pathway for someone who is, I'm trying to think of a really good, uh, someone like Venki Iyer might be, an interesting one to have a look at. I'm trying to think if there's any other country examples that I can think of at recent times where you had a player who was out of the system, but there was still a system that they could play in, which meant that people could see what they were doing and they could move them across. And I think that maybe that's where we fail a little bit more with cricket. And I have a look at the English system, is one that is really interesting from that perspective. Perhaps the South African system is another one that's really interesting with that, from that. So if you're not in that system, and the ECB, I promise you, I think they have a real bias towards the players that they have picked at a very early age. And I've heard them talk about this before, and I think they see it as a strength. But I think if you're not, I think the other bias should be, can we find a guy at 25 like Jake Lintott, right? Who can go on to play for the country as well. And you really want that combination of those people, because you don't want to miss out on two or three. And quite often the people who don't come through the academies, they have skills that cricket teams don't necessarily have. And I don't just mean emotionally, although, you look at someone like Dirk Nannes, he was a very important person in that Victorian cricket culture, partly because he didn't come up through it. It wasn't his culture. So he could go, that's bullshit. We shouldn't be doing that. And just a simple thing like that is really important. But also different coaching methods, because they might have come from other sports or how they've developed themselves. And quite often, if you come from outside the system, you have a freak natural outlier aspect to the way that you play. You might think about batting differently or bowling differently or fielding plans differently or whatever that may be. So I think any junior system, I have no problem doing that, because you want to develop players, maybe not from 12 and 14, but certainly from 15, 16. You want to start developing players, that you think you want to start molding them towards the sort of players that you want further on. However, if there is no system, that continues to push everyone else, you're just going to, there's a point. I think it was the ECB who said this. They said, if you look at how many players we picked at around the age of 15 or 16, it might have even been earlier than that went on to play for England. It shows how good our system is. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, because you picked those players and you developed those players, you didn't actually see all the other players and how they could have developed. And you probably then had a bias towards the players you'd already picked over the players that you hadn't picked. And I think if you look at English cricket, Benny Howell is maybe a very, very good a version of that, where it's like, well, he doesn't fit in any of our boxes, so we don't know what to do with him. So we're just going to move Benny Howell to the side. It doesn't mean that he should have played for England or anything else. It's more that they didn't really trial him enough to see if he should have played for England. And I do think that happens with a lot of later developing players at times, where I think they had it with Dawid Milan as well. I think there is, a system sometimes that if you're not a star at 18 or 19, that you move on from them, forgetting that you may be a very average player at the age of 20, but at the age of 27, 28, you may have completely worked out what it means. And then you're in your prime years, and that international team can get 3 or 4 years out of you. I don't think cricket, as it's currently set up almost worldwide, thinks about it that way. They really think, how can we get the next 20, 21, 22-year-old in, so they'll be in for the next 10 years, not noticing how many 21, 22-year-olds they've burnt through on the way, right? And sometimes ruined before those players could have even gone on to develop further. So I think that answers your question, James. Aditya says, do you think, given the facilities and support system available today to international players from the top teams, and specifically Indian players, someone like Vinod Cambly would have survived longer in the game and been able to fulfill some of the early, work that he did? Vinod Cambly is a really interesting one, because of the caste system is really interesting, but also because he's that first flashy Indian player, right? He, in some ways, he's like a less successful Allen Iverson. And you look at his numbers domestically after he's dropped, and you hear people go, oh, he wasn't good enough and everything. You look at his international numbers overall, but you look at those domestic numbers and you go, there was certainly something there. I think he was the wrong person at the wrong time. I don't think now he could be pushed aside so easily with Indian social media, with Indian media the way it is. I think there would be a lot of people now upset. So I think you have to factor that side in. What else do you have to factor in with him? He really was. I talked to Srisanth about this, because Srisanth was another rock star-y type cricketer. Srisanth was the sort of person trying to drag all his teammates to the trendiest nightclubs and buy everyone drinks and hang out with celebrities and all that sort of stuff, which is, if you think about the era he played with, Laxman, Dravid, Tendulkar, Sehwag, they're not really those kinds of people. Um, and he kind of said to me that he felt like even before the match fixing thing came up, he kind of felt like they were looking for a reason to move on for him because he wasn't that sort of person. I think Indian cricket has changed a lot. So Vinod Kambli specifically would not stick out in the same way now. There's plenty of players with tattoos and attitude and chains and everything in Indian cricket now. So I think from that perspective, um, but I also think from a franchise perspective, think about it. If you're Vinod Kambli now, and Alex Hales is a really good example of this. England didn't want Alex Hales, right? They moved on from Alex Hales. They weren't going back to any Alex Hales like business. Alex Hales just went around the world playing franchise cricket, embarrassing them. That's a lot different than in Vinod Kambli's time when he's like a line item in a newspaper, right? Other than local press, no one's really looking at anything other than the fact that he scored a lot of runs again. And that's a huge difference than turning on your TV and seeing Alex Hales being the top player and having all the T20 nerds talk about him and, CricViz doing a special on him. CricViz following, Cricinfo or CricBuzz following what he's done in some random tournament. It's just a very different world from that perspective. I still think that, though, and it goes back to James's question, I still think that cricket is not particularly well set up to handle outlier personalities. It's such a weird sport because it is such a individual sport within a team environment, and I think most modern coaching sort of stems off the Australians because they sort of set up what modern cricket coaching was. And I think in Australia, cricket's much more like football in that it is much more a team endeavor. And, if you spend time in English cricket culture and Asian cricket culture and Australian cricket culture, you see one of the big differences is that, the way that Australians sort of bond together as a team. And that I think that just comes from going hand in hand with probably Aussie rules football, but maybe rugby league, the way that they all grew together. I don't know why it's a little bit different. But that affects the coaching because it does mean that individuals are not always as well accepted into those sorts of environments. You're supposed to, all for one for all, maybe doesn't quite fit. So I still think cricket has a problem with that. So I still think someone like Vinod Kambli would have a problem with that. But if he's around today, he'd be an IPL star, right? And I don't know how India would be able to ignore him as much. And you would probably get maybe a situation like now where, Prithvi Shaw, a completely different kind of person, but there are problems with Prithvi Shaw that the Indians don't want him around, but if he averages 40 with a strike rate of 160 one year, going to be hard to ignore him in the way that you could ignore players like that in first class cricket before. If you look at that, Fawad Alam type situation. If you look at the Dean Jones type situation, there's been a lot of incredibly talented players who, in earlier eras, yeah, they're really talented, but they're dominating in first class cricket. No one's watching it, and it doesn't matter, right? I think that is I have a harder thing to do now, just because of the way that cricket is covered and talked about, and social media, and the many opportunities you have to play in front of a camera, which is not just for your country anymore. Will says, "Do you think it's too early for Rehan Ahmed to be brought into the England Test squad, or is he, as good as the other leg spin options already?" I think it's the all round ability with him as well, isn't it? So I don't know if he's better than the other leg spinners. I've done a little bit of look at his footage today from a technical standpoint. Also, I sent it to another friend of mine who's an expert in spinners. We're both worried about his front arm from a technical side of things. In Test cricket, I think to be a consistent leg spinner, you really do need a strong front arm, and just kind of putting his front arm out there. So I worry about that. He's a wrong and bowler, and sometimes some wrong and bowlers do that because they want to drop their left arm a little bit more. And he does seem very wrong and dependent. Again, not sure how many wrong and dependent Test match leg spinners we've seen. It's really early on for him. I worry about the hype aspect. There's been a couple of young players that England have thrown in recently and just really overhyped. And you look at them and go, they're flawed players with a long way to go. If he wasn't a flawed player at his age, he would have already played more games. And I'm not saying that means he's not going to have a huge development curve of recent times and suddenly be a frontline player in county cricket. He's obviously talented enough for that. But the problem is he hasn't played enough of that. So he doesn't have the experience. it could be a situation where you get a good few games out of him, and then after a while, maybe 5 or 6 test matches, maybe even longer than that. You might get a year. People start to work out how to play him, and everything starts to calm down. That's the real tricky period, and that's the period that he's incredibly confident, and he's never had a setback really in his career so far, and he's going to play Test cricket probably, or at least possibly, well before he's even developed as a first class player. And now he's going to have cameras on him. Now he's going to have a million people with opinions on him and everything else. It's really tough for someone that young to be able to do that. If England are right, and he's an absolute freak, then that may not matter. If he's not, and he's just a young kid with bravado, and suddenly he has, I don't know, Athers or Wasm Akram saying, "Oh, you can see the technical faults here," or maybe he's just not good enough, or whatever that may be. Um, is he the right person to be able to pull back from that? We've seen Matt Renshaw really struggle with that. We've seen Zach Crawley fighting his own technical problems. It's really tough on young players if you don't know your game inside and out, and there's no way he can. If they're just saying to him, "Look, we're going to play you in this tour because we think it might suit your batting and bowling," we we still need to see you go back and churn out runs in first class cricket, and we want to see you play for the Lions and everything else. And he knows that going in, that's maybe a better situation to go in. So say you're not being if you play in this tour, one test, let's say, and you do okay in it, and you don't play for another 6 to 12 months. We don't want you to think you're dropped and we're not interested. What we want is for you to develop in all those other ways. That's the adult way of dealing with this. Generally, what happens with the young player is they come in and they either fail straight away and they disappear, or they have success and they get massively overhyped, and then it becomes hard to drop them, and then you have to drop them, and then they go off and they disappear into the system, and it causes problems for you further down the line. So it's again, a lot of these things are just development issues, right? Ray says, can anyone stop the Adelaide Strikers this year? So it's really interesting. I was looking at these numbers, Ray, of them. I think it just went through to the final. I think that's right. I saw the game, but I saw the scorecard, but I've forgotten. I think it was the final, wasn't it? They're really interesting, the Strikers, because I think their 3 top batters are all striking around run a ball. And, there's a lot of players striking far quicker than they are. Pardon the pun. A lot of a lot of batters striking far quicker than they are at the moment. And so I think from that perspective, it's a really bowling dependent team. When you look at their bowling, I think Megan Schutt has 26 wickets and Amanda Wellington has 22 or 23. They're both one's averaging 12 and one's averaging 15. That is like, I can't remember the last time I saw 2 bowlers in any T20 franchise league with those kinds of. It's the amount of wickets and the average, which is a bit unique in that situation. So you quite often get bowlers who, with good averages, but maybe they haven't bowled that much, or they play a little section of a season, and so you get a wild swing. They played at 20. What is it? 48 wickets, 49 wickets between the two of them. It's a lot of wickets at a really low average over a good chunk of the season now. That's a phenomenal record, and it must mean. I think they must both be averaging 2 wickets a game. I'm trying to do this off the top of my head, trying to remember how many games they've played, which means that going in against them, that their 2 main bowlers are going to take 4 wickets. You add in 1 run out. Women's cricket doesn't quite have as many run outs as it used to have, but you add in 1 run out, you're now at 5 wickets. That means the other 3 bowlers only need to chip in around 1 wicket each, and you're already well into your tail. And associate cricket, women's cricket is very similar to a lot of franchise cricket. The depth of that sort of 6, 7, 8, 9 thing is quite often where it gets a bit tricky. Just the way that franchise cricket kind of works, and you don't have as many of the sort of longer batting lineups you sometimes see in international cricket. And so if you're going in and you're probably getting 5 wickets out of a run out and your 2 main bowlers, that you're going to be testing the depth of every team. The only way to play against the Strikers really is to go all in with an abnormally long batting lineup, where you're batting down to 9 or 10, if you have that many batters available to you and just try and throw it up against them and just go, okay, we're going to take your wickets, fine. We're going to go all out attack with the bat. And knowing that the strikers with the bat maybe can't score as many runs. I don't know why I'm helping anyone else. I don't know. They lost to the Scorchers. I'm trying to think if I know any of the women's coaches at the moment in the women's Big Bash. Yeah, that would be the way I'd look at it. But it's a really interesting franchise team at the moment. Ian says, why does it appear that David Warner is now so keen to have his leadership ban overturned? Is he, what does it appear David Warner is now? Is he really an option for Australia at this stage? Or is it just a Sydney Thunder thing? I think for Warner, I haven't talked to him. I think he's always been keen on having the ban. I think they all knew that the bans were ridiculous and over the top, and he's never spoken out about it. Really, he said a little bit, um, but I think if you talk to him privately, I think you'd probably get a different view on how he feels on all this. And I think he feels like he played the good employee, still got shafted, and then they looked after the other guys and maybe not him as much. And partly it's just because of his reputation, I think, as much as anything else. And he was the easiest scapegoat, and I think he is aware of that. And so it did. I think it has upset him. I don't think it's so much that David Warner is now keen to have his leadership ban overturned. I just think there's a movement within cricket, and he'd be silly if he wasn't part of it. They kind of, he really should have been the one-day captain if there was no ban. It would have made most sense going into the next World Cup. He was definitely going to play in it. Um, and Pat Cummins doesn't play enough. Ridiculous, suggestion to think he was ever going to be able to do it. With made captain and was rested for his second or third game, was it? So I do think that is part of it. I don't think the Sydney Thunder thing is a big part because I don't think he'll ever probably play a lot of cricket for Sydney Thunder unless he sort of has a retirement gig at the end when his shoulder is or knees or whatever it is that slow him down eventually get to him. But I just think that the thought process within Australian cricket of the people I've talked to is we don't really have a captain, and we have a guy here who can actually captain, and it's a hangover from a stupid decision made by authorities who are trying to cover their own ass, despite the fact that many executives at Cricket Australia knew that things were going too far, and that there was issues there. And as I've said, ball tampering is not a one-person job. The entire team knew it was going on. To suspend 3 players is an absolute. It was a joke at the time, and it's been a joke ever since. And then to give one player this incredible extra punishment, I just think that at the time they were getting bad PR, and they've been trying to find a way to dig themselves out of it ever since. And I think David Warner's just trying to put a bit of pressure on them. I, I, I think he would love to captain Australia, but I don't think it's just about that. I just think it's also about he does feel like he was unfairly treated. He was unfairly treated. The whole thing was. Kennedy says, do you think living in Melbourne instead of India has affected Shikhar Dhawan's career? Yes, he's much more attractive, so much more intelligent, like we all are from being from Melbourne. No, because I mean, I think if you look at the way he plays, I don't see a huge. Sometimes you see a player. I'm trying to think of someone specifically, but you do see a player who is like it might be a. I'm trying to think. Someone like Otis Gibson, West Indian bowler, obviously spent so much of his time in England, and he sort of combined the two regions into his bowling eventually. Imran Tahir, perhaps someone who had to learn how to bowl on non-Asian pitches, which has come into he basically built the last 7 years of his career on his ability to bowl on pitches that weren't, as in his favour as the ones he probably would have bowled on earlier on in his career. So you do see players do that from that perspective. I can't see anything off the top of my head in Shikhar Dhawan's game, right, where I could say to myself, this is a direct response to him playing in Australia. I'd have to have a closer look. As far as as far as within the team, I mean, he still gets picked. It's an interesting dynamic. Um, there are so many players who live in the UAE that, and it's not that publicly known. And there's a couple of international players who live in England really as well. And again, it's not as well known. So Shikhar Dhawan's one is probably a little bit more famous and everything else. But as far as his career, I don't see anything. But I think it's a really good question. And I'll probably start looking now to see if I can see anything different. But I don't see anything that's affected him directly. It probably helps him. This is something I was told by other people, and I don't know Shikhar Dhawan at all, but that he's one of those athletes who struggles a little bit more with his, not emotions is the wrong thing, but most of the best players are very, very even keeled, right? Most of the time, through wins, through losses. I've heard that Shikhar Dhawan can be someone who, gets up and gets down a little bit more. Um, Living outside of India, and outside of the fishbowl, maybe helps him regulate that a little bit more. But that's like a lot of pop psychology and remembering conversations in bars with other players and stuff, rather than anything factual. Christopher says, as we start to get more associate countries involved in cricket, do you think first class Test cricket is ever a long term plan for them? From my point of view, it would be my dream to see 20 countries plus long term cricket, but I wonder if that's realistic. Look, I think I remember when I first started with Scotland, they were really clear saying that T20 was their plan. And I think there was certainly a feeling from Scotland that Ireland, not Ireland had got it wrong, but Ireland obviously were desperate to get Test status, and Scotland would bite your hand off for it as well. But I think Scotland were looking at that and going, yeah, but then actually you end up getting judged on all your white ball cricket, and you might not play any tests anyway. And to be fair, Ireland haven't. But it made their future a little bit more financially stable, and certainly helped them within organizations within the country. So it does go both ways. But I'd be very surprised now unless you had a international team some associate team who just has, I don't know, let's say Namibia, and you suddenly look at it and go, oh, they're not, they're T20 cricket. They can't get anyone who could score at a strike rate of over 110. So they're never going to be a top level T20 team. But they have all these bowlers, all these left arm seamers who can hit the top of off stump with a little bit of all round skill, and maybe they can be a very good nagging, Test team. Would it be, in that situation, might a team, I don't know, follow that? It's possible, right? But I don't think any team's going to make it their plan just because of the way that cricket is going, the way that you get financing, the way that you get crowds, all these different things. And even if let's say you are Namibia, but if you have 2 or 3 good T20 players, they're still going to get yanked away to play in franchises anyway, right? So I don't see how that works as a model. If we keep Test cricket around, though, and we continue to get more and more teams who are good at it, I don't see that as a problem going forward. And I do think if we can work out a way to make money off Test cricket, and which there are obvious ways to make money off Test cricket that we're not currently doing, if that's the case, then there'll be an economy there. So that will also work for associate teams, and will work, if we ever end up with some form of franchise Test cricket or something else. So I think it's less likely for that to happen just because people involved are not able to do it for many different reasons. Sometimes just don't understand it. And the easy thing to see is T20 cricket. So I think more likely we'll have more good teams, but they'll be white ball teams. All right. Let us go to the room. See who we have. Ashish, you there?
Yeah. Hello, Jared.
Hey, mate. What's your question?
Yeah. Did you happen to watch the documentary by the India through the Serbia documentary yet?
No, it came out on YouTube, I think, last night. So I haven't seen it yet. Is it good?
Yeah, it's quite good. Like I like the way how they dispersed the geopolitical aspect of it with into a travelogue, into a pilgrimage sort of thing. It's quite good. You should catch it.
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in Melbourne, and there was so many Croatian and Serbian people. So a lot of my friends when I was growing up were like that. In fact, here's my favorite story about Serbian culture from my life, which was that I dated a Croatian girl, and she said that her mum hated me so much that her mum had said that she preferred that she dated a Serbian. And this was not long after. This is not long after the wars and the conflicts and everything else. And I was like, I just don't think this relationship is going to last long term. But anyway, mate, what's your question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, okay, if you had like the ideal, like if you had like an unlimited budget in a franchise tournament, how many, like, so I was just thinking of it in terms of like how many ceiling raising players would you have, how many floor raising players would you have, and how many like average players you would have in an starting 11, for example. That's what I was asking.
Yeah, I think what you really want is you want ceiling raising batters and floor raising bowlers, because that's kind of offense versus defense. So you probably, I think every bowling lineup you want two strike options. You want Amanda Wellington and Megan Shute, if we're being honest. But you want that kind of ability to be able to take wickets at that level. So you probably want two of those, and then your other three bowlers you probably want as your bowlers, right? No, not that they won't take wickets and at different times, but Sunil Narine, who's it? The Sunrisers said they got rid of Rashid Khan because he doesn't take wickets, and it's like, well, he doesn't take wickets because no one will play shots off him. Um, so you still want
Yeah,
that
like
bowler,
Rashid and Narayan are like the perfect floor raising bowlers, I would say, right? Because they're
yeah.
very economical.
No, exactly. I mean, you look at Hasaranga and Tikshana, right? Like Sri Lanka's not a great team, but you bowl those two guys for 6 or 7 overs combined, and if you attack them, you're probably going to lose wickets. And you probably against Tikshana, you're probably going to have to chip him around a little bit. And with Hasaranga, to score quickly off him, you can, but you have to take big risks, right? Um, it, Hasaranga at the moment is probably a ceiling raising bowler, right? And Tikshana is probably a floor raising bowler, but probably going ahead, eventually everyone's going to have to, unless Hasaranga's bowling gets worse, right? People are going to eventually just going to have to stop trying to get out to him, right? And we've seen that before. Bhuvi was once a ceiling raising player, and now he's a floor raising player, which is probably why he doesn't fit into the Indian setup as much anymore, right? So, that happens with bowlers. You get so good in T20 cricket that you don't get as many wickets anymore, which is such a weird way of thinking about it. But that is essentially what happens. I didn't look last year, but I don't think Rashid Khan again was one of the leading bowlers. But his team did pretty well, right? So if you think about it from this perspective of, say you're the bowler who's bowling at the other end to Rashid Khan, and his over's just gone for 6 runs, they're going to take more risks off you. Right. So you have that ability. So that's when you compare him up with someone like that. So I think from that perspective, that's what I would like. And then with batting, and I'm sort of leaving out all round talent here a little bit, but with batting, I want to have in my top 7. I probably want to have 4 players who have the ability to completely transform a game in one way or another. And then I probably want 2 players with a basic sort of all-round ability to give me a flexibility there. And then I want 1 top-level batting talent. I would prefer them not to play like an anchor. I prefer them to play like AB de Villiers. But if they play like an anchor, and I can use them as a rotation piece throughout, so one day I'm going to get them to open because I don't know. And Berendorf is just tearing through the competition, and we need an opener to make sure that no one goes out to Berendorf. Fine. Next game it's Rashid Khan, so I'm going to have them there. Those sorts of things are the way that I would be looking at doing that in that sort of fantastical, perfect world situation. Because if you look at that, then you should have your 6 or 7 players who can win you a game, and then your 5 or 6 players who keep you in a lot of games.
Yep. Yeah. Can I ask one more question? If you don't
Yeah,
mind.
sure.
Yeah. What is easier to upskill a batsman to make him bowl, or a bowler to make him bat?
I would have always said that it's easier to upskill a batter to make him a bowler. I think traditionally, um, if you look at the history of cricket, here's a really interesting. Actually, no, I still think I fundamentally agree with that. If you look at the history of cricket, so you would have heard so much more about how tail enders are so much better now. the actual average of tailenders in Test cricket hasn't improved, right? So all that Steve Waugh stuff of, training tailenders and all this thing now about everyone needs to bat and how you only pick a spinner if they've got secondary skill with a bat. It doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work goes back to what we talk about a lot on this show, which is to be able to bat and face people bowling at over 80 miles an hour is a specialist skill that only a few people on the planet have managed to work out. And you can't learn that as a tailender. You can develop your batting over the length of your career. And once you get, if you know that you have Jasprit Bumrah or Glenn McGrath and they're going to be around for 10 years, right? I do think there are things you can do to make them slightly better, right? But I don't think you can ever take someone who doesn't have that innate ability to saccade and understand where the ball is going to go and get in the right positions. If they don't have those skills, you're polishing a turd, and maybe the turd is shiny at the end, but it's still a turd, right? If you're a genuine number 11, what's your best case scenario is that you're a plucky number 9, right? Not saying that you should be trying to do that, right? You still should be trying to do that. I do think that if you look at Michael Bevan, Michael Yardy, Ravi Shastri, Mark Richardson, that there is something to be said for finding a batter with spin talent, and especially if there is something else that pushes it. So if you're Michael Clarke or Sachin Tendulkar, chances are you don't have the time to fix your bowling properly, right? But if you're Michael Bevan and you're in and out and you're not playing Test cricket, and you might have a chance to fix your bowling a little bit. If you're Ravi Shastri and you're Mark Richardson and your batting actually fails, Mark Richardson went the other way around, but you know what I mean. If Mark Richardson if Mark Richardson's batting had not flourished, right, and instead of coming back and averaging 45 with the bat, he averages 35 with the bat, he probably has to work out a way to make his bowling work again. If you look at George Dockrell, that's exactly what's happened there. And if you look at Shastri's case, he's probably the only way I'm going to get picked here is if my bowling is off a certain level. And it's really interesting to me how often you get a player who is quite often picked on all-round talent, but when they get really good at that specialist batting talent, the bowling drops off, right? That tells me that they no longer need to work on their bowling anymore. And that's a part of it. Some of it is physical as well. So Mike Atherton told me that he couldn't bowl anymore because he batted so much that his back got sore, right? Michael Clarke had the same thing. Yeah. So both of them had chronic back injuries, right? Dave Warner told me that I asked Dave Warner why he stopped bowling, and he said it's just hurting his shoulder. And in T20 cricket, he needed his shoulders to be powerful. So there are lots of little things like that happen. But I do think that there's a huge reason why we have less part-timers than ever before. And I think it's threefold. I think it's having more net bowlers and having throwdown people, right? Which is kind of one whole thing. The other one is that these players do travel so much. Yeah, well, yeah, that's the last one. I'll get to that one. But the other one is that these players travel so much and they're in planes and cars and buses and everything more often than their predecessors were. I think that's a problem. And then the last one is that hyper specialization type of thing. More often than not, if you look at the best, if I was to give you the list right now, give me your top 5 all-rounders in the world, right? Just off the top of your head, just bang me out 5 all-rounders.
Hardik Pandya,
Yep.
Andre Russell.
Yep.
It's Stan Curran probably, but I wouldn't. Ben Stokes, Ben Stokes.
Ravi Jadeja, Shadab Khan. Let's just put those 5 out there, right? You could throw Jason Holder in there as well, right?
Rashid Khan also probably.
Rashid Khan's probably slightly different, but yeah, if you look at the majority of those players we've mentioned, they are freak athletes, right? Especially for cricket. Like, Ben Stokes doesn't look like and move like other England cricketers. Shadab Khan doesn't move like other Pakistani cricketers. Ravi Jadeja doesn't move like other Indian cricketers, right? So to be an actual all-rounder, you probably need to be a different kind of physical specimen to begin with, right? And I think if you go back in the history if you go back to Keith Miller, one of the greatest physical athletes we've ever had in cricket, Imran Khan, right? Kapil Dev, these are not the normal cricket athletes that we see coming through. So I think to be a true all-rounder, you have to be a different kind of physical specimen. And if you look at some of the all-rounders, the sort of batters who bowl a little bit, they probably don't. The reason that they're not bowlers is because they don't have bowling bodies, right? They don't have that physical athleticism to be able to go. So I do think there is a toll that goes on it. But I think if you look at, here's two really good examples for you. If you go through the history of ODI cricket, there are two batters who bowled more than 5 overs a game who no one would ever think about as all-rounders, but probably qualify as all-rounders. And those two players are Viv Richards and Darren Lehman, right? Now, both of them are shit. They're both shit bowlers. Like, I don't want to slag them off. Very skillful at other things they do. And to be able to be that successful in ODI cricket without any innate bowling talent, I think is incredible. But why did they become really, really good bowlers? And it's because they're smart enough to know where to put the ball where it makes it just a little bit difficult for the other player, right? Just that little bit difficult. Look at Darren Lehman dropping his arm, right? He did that before, but way before we talked about it in T20 cricket. Darren Lehman could bowl with a high arm action, a normal arm action, and a low arm action, right? And he was trying to skid that old ball through and all these sorts of skills that he'd learnt from watching spinners bowl to him, right? Viv Richards used to bowl quite quick, a little bit like we see with Joe Root. They're not spinners. They don't think like spinners, but they think like batters. And I think that is handy. I'm not sure that that helps a bowler when he's batting. And what I mean by that is a bowler might be able to go, well, he's bowled this ball, so he's going to bowl that ball. That's great. But if he's bowling at 85 miles an hour and you can't saccade your eyes, even knowing that he's going to bowl the full and straight one doesn't matter. Shane Warne's a perfect example of this. Everyone always talked about Shane Warne being a potential all-rounder, and it never quite happened, did it? He was always on the verges of it, but he never quite made it happen. And if you look at him early in his innings, couldn't pick up the ball. If you could bowl straight and full early on to Shane Warne, you were a huge chance of getting him out early. He just couldn't pick the ball up properly, right? It wasn't that he wasn't smart enough. It wasn't that he didn't find a method, because I think in those two ways, he was a very clever player. It was that on a very, very scientific level, just wasn't picking the ball up well enough, especially early on, right? And because of that, it meant he was really susceptible to full and straight balls at his pads, and that was never going to be able to overcome it. And I remember talking to Darren Goff about his batting, and he kind of felt the same thing. He thought that he had some skills that should have made him a better batter, but he could never quite bring them together. And when I sort of came up with this theory, he went, do you know what? That's probably what it was. Like, if I was in for a while, I felt like I could see the ball a little bit better. But when I first got in, it felt like everything was just a bit sped up for me. Until we can get to a point where we can train players to do that, I think it's always going to be easier to train a batter to have a handy bowling skill than vice versa. Having said that, everything you've talked about, hyper specialization, and the fact that batters just don't bowl in the nets anymore, means that at the moment we're not doing that. But watch this space, because I'm doing something on that topic. I'm doing a big review of Indian T20 cricket, and one of the things I'm talking about is that. So thank you for that. Those questions. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thanks for that, mate. Who have we got here? James. James never comes through, but let's see if he does. James, you there, mate? Oh, see a flutter of life. James, you've got mute on. If you take mute off, give it a go. He has written a question down there. James says, are players like Nathan Lyon and Marcus Harron inherently better players in general than a white ball superstar batter with short-lived or bad first-class test careers? Okay. They have better fundamentals. Doesn't necessarily mean... I'd find it very hard to believe that Kieron Pollard is not a better player than Marcus Harris. Right? Marnus Labuschagne's a bit different, because he's one of the best players in the world at his particular thing. But I find it very, very hard to believe that Kieron Pollard, I'm trying to think of someone else, those sorts of players are not better than Marcus Harris. And I think that had Kieron Pollard gone on to play a lot of Test cricket and first-class cricket, you look at his numbers, I think he would have been a really decent player. I'm not sure his bowling would have translated brilliantly, but having a guy who can bowl high 70s at 6'7" or whatever he is, and a strong 6'7", would have been quite a handy second skill to have. And he probably, his first class average was still better than most of the top order batters that were picked for the West Indies. And he only played a little bit of it. I think if you're looking at a player who is Marcus Harris level in white ball cricket, um, and then you're looking at Marcus Harris, then you're probably saying that Marcus Harris probably has some extra skills available to him. But it it does mean that we're sort of slightly downplaying some of the white ball skills that are necessary. So we are looking then more at a technician style of things. And so, is Andre, I say Andre Russell, he's a bad example. Is Tim David, right? Is Tim David someone who could have done what Marcus Harris has done if he'd got the breaks and played more first class cricket and everything else? I don't know. Aaron Finch, right? That they tried it. I still lean towards the fact that red ball cricket tests you out in more different ways, pardon the pun, than white ball cricket does. And so you probably do need a slightly higher skill level. But there are other parts to white ball cricket. I'm going to spin this way because batters and bowlers are so different. I think if you're a red ball cricketer who can average 40 in the red ball, you've probably got a higher skill level than a lot of the white ball guys who can't average 35, right? Bowling, though, I think some of the most skillful bowlers that we've seen coming through of recent times have been those white ball bowlers. Whereas in red ball cricket, at the moment in red ball cricket, I shit you not, you only need to learn the wobble ball, right? And how many great bowlers have there been, or not great bowlers, but very, very good bowlers in Test match cricket who basically had an outswinger, right? Or just a very good off break, whatever that may be. So in some ways, in batting, I think there's maybe slightly more skill in that situation. Whereas in bowling, I think there might not be, and there might be slightly more skill in some of the white ball bowlers. Not all white ball bowlers. There's some gloriously one-dimensional white ball bowlers out there as well. But I do think you probably have to. It'd be very hard at the moment to have one delivery in T20 cricket and be a success. You can have one delivery in Test cricket and be a success if that one ball is, a very good stock ball from that perspective. We had a couple more speakers, but they just dropped out. Um, Keshav says, why do we take the right-handed batting as the reference for explaining different kinds of spin bowling, whichever way it turns? And so the reason we use right-handed is because if you look at the history of the game, back in the old days, I think it was 80% of players are right-handed. And if you play club cricket, it was even a higher percentage of right-handers. I think we're now at around 65% right-handed to 35% left-hand at the professional level. If you play club cricket again, I would say that goes down a lot more. I don't think in club cricket level you would ever have around 35% of people being left-handed with the bat. Uh, so I think that right-handed just becomes the dominant thing, and it doesn't make sense because I mean it was funny. I was having to explain to an American recently. They were interviewing me about something, and I was explaining about in swing and outswing. And I and I sort of said, "In swing swings back into you," and then I went, "Unless you're left-handed." Like, it's not the right way of doing it, but a lot of these terms, off spin, leg spin, in swing, out swing, they are off cutter, leg cutter. They come from a time when there just weren't many left-handers around. So yeah, I mean, we could change them now. It's weird, and also some people you do notice. This is one thing I notice because of the way that I listen to these sorts of things. But some people do flick between them. So like I'm listening on the radio one day, and I hear someone say something along the lines of, Ishant Sharma has bowled an outswinger to the left-hander, and I'll be like, what? Ishant Sharma can't bowl an outswinger to the left-hander, and then I realize what they mean is he swung the ball away, and not everyone does that, and so you sometimes even hear in commentary two different commentators talking over each other. I remember that in club cricket once, a batter getting the wrong information because the left-hander had said, watch out for this guy's outswinger. Outswingers? Yeah. Watch out for this guy's outswinger. And so the right-hander went out first ball, shouldered arm, and the ball pitched on off stump. And of course, it came back and I think it hit leg. The complete opposite way of what which way he thought it was swinging. So yeah, look, but I just think those things are just a what's the best way of putting it? A relic of this game being really old. We started talking about off spin, leg spin, off cutter, leg cutter, probably 1870s. And outswingers probably, what, 10, 15 years after that. So, well over 120 years for all of them. And I've never gone back and done the numbers on early test cricket, but it's really noticeable before 1980 even. If a left-handers always get singled out in a way that right-handers don't. And I think that must be just because they are seen as far more rare, whereas now we don't see them as rare. And so many right-handers now bat left-handed that it, it changes everything. All right, one last question from Shake. Oh, I don't know. Shake was there and then he disappeared. All right. I will end it here. Just a huge shout out to all the 99.94 crew. I've been binge listening the West Indies and Indian episodes recently. I think those are the two teams. I haven't got to South Africa yet. That'll be my next binge listen. But those are the two teams that come out of the World Cup with the biggest existential crisis. Even if you're not a fan of the West Indies one, the three-part series that Michelle and Santoki have put together is incredible. And then Nikesh and Sarah have been going through the Indian T20 team. I think the last podcast might have been their ideal 11s for must be for the next World Cup, I assume. But you know, that's a really good episode as well. So I do think if you haven't listened to these things, getting more and more each day. Mitch Johnson, that podcast is getting really good. The more you listen to our podcasts, the more podcasts that we can afford to bring on. And we're hoping to announce a new one very soon. And we've got a couple in the works, but as it currently stands, that's where that's the direction that we're currently going. So support your local 99.94 podcast and support all of them, I suppose. Anyway, thanks for coming on this chat, and I will see you again next week.